Number 10, Princess Diana's last words. Okay, since Harry and Meghan were trending recently, I figured we'd open with this one. First responder who actually rescued Princess Diana that fateful day during that fateful crash. The same first responder opened up last year to speak about said incident and even Diana's final words before her untimely death later on August 31st, 1997. Now that day, Diana and her boyfriend Dodi Fayed were being followed by a group of paparazzi in Paris. Just an insane reason to kick off all of this nonsense. But during this chaos, the driver of her car lost control in the tunnel. There's still a lot of, what happened there going on with the driver. I'll save that for later. Sergeant Xavier Gourbalan was on duty that day and he did not know that Princess Diana was the one involved in that accident. Now he said after Fayed was removed, I was left with the passenger. Now she spoke in English and she asked, "My God, what happened?" She didn't say anything else until she later passed at the hospital. Number 9, Tupac's last words. Chris Carroll, who has since retired from the Las Vegas Metro Police Department back in 2010, at the time he was a bike patrol officer working a night shift on the evening of September 7th, 1996. He was working outside of the MGM Grand Hotel. Now I can't say certain things or details on YouTube because, rules and violations and yada yada yada. But after Tupac was attacked, sure, Chris Carroll was the first responder on the scene. In his words, here's what happened, according to an article on Billboard. Quote, "So I'm looking at Tupac, and he's trying to yell back at Suge. Suge Knight was also involved, of course. And I'm asking him, who attacked you? What happened? Who did it? Anything, right? And he was just kind of ignoring me. He was making eye contact with me here and there, but overall, he's trying to yell at Suge. And I kept asking him over and over, who did this? Who attacked you? And he basically kept ignoring me. And then I saw in his face and in his movements, all of a sudden, in the snap of a finger, he changed. And he went from struggling to speak, being non-cooperative, to an I'm at peace type of behavior. So just like that, he went from fighting to I can't do it. And then when he made that transition, then he looked at me. And he's looking at me right in my eyes. And that's when I looked at him and I said, one more time, who did this? Who attacked you? And he looked at me, he took a breath to get the words out, and then he opened his mouth, and I thought I was actually going to get some cooperation. And then the words came out, F you. I can't say it, obviously, but yeah, he said F you. He didn't say anything. And at that point, an ambulance showed up and he went into unconsciousness, end quote. How amazing is that? I mean, obviously it's not amazing that Tupac died, but the fact that he went out like that and didn't say anything. Number 8, Dark Revenge. This one was posted by a username, My Dog Operates Better Than You. Great name, really great name. Interesting nurse story, here we go. I did a rotation in a burn unit. There are tons of stories that go around, but I'll share my favorite. A man attacked one of his night workers one night, but as soon as this flame was lit, the victim, she immediately bear hugged him, causing them both to suffer pretty severe injuries, pretty severe burns, and unfortunately, hers included an inhalation burn, so her fate was unfortunately sealed. Later on, they were both being treated in the same ICU on opposite ends, but sadly, weeks later, she ended up coding and passed away. And for about 30 minutes, as things started to quiet down, that guy, that not so great guy that did all this, he starts randomly screaming from his room, "Get her out, get her out." Okay, this one's got layers because it's not her last words per se, but many people have heard this story and have agreed that she was saying some nasty stuff to him before moving on, right? Or else who's he talking about? Either way, I'm sure that's gonna be haunting him at night regardless. Thank you for sharing. My Dog Operates Better Than You. And also, again, great name. Number 7, The Man in Black. Oh, this is scary. This story gave me the creeps when I read it online. Here we go. A nice old lady who told my CNA that she wanted to wear all white. Now, when I asked why, she said that the man in black is here. Now, she looked in the corner of the room. The CNA also looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said, "He's in all black and he's got a top hat on." That's terrifying. "The Hat Man," she said, and then she whispered, "and his eyes are red," while her eyes moved across the room directly to behind that CNA, almost as if she was watching him move closer to us while describing him, which is terrifying. Now, sadly, she died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. It almost reminds me of that story that Aaron Rodgers was telling recently about this weird hat man, like this all black hat man in the shadows that he's seeing after he did some ayahuasca trip. What's everyone seeing? Who is this hat man? I'm terrified. Number 6, Hey. This one's from a nurse with username Hella Clogged. Great name, I love these names. When I was a nursing student up on an ICU floor, I was hanging antibiotics in my patient's room when I heard an audible hey. Now, I turn around, as anyone would, and there is no one else in the room, okay? Mind you, my patient was sedated, so there's no possible way that it was them. Also, it was a woman's voice as well, so I thought that it was my preceptor. Now, I went back out to the nurse's station and I asked my coworker if that was her in the room trying to catch my attention, and she told me no, and I've never seen someone's eyes get so large. Apparently, the room that I was in had the most paranormal sightings and activity out of all the rooms in the unit. Awesome. That's lovely to hear. Imagine that. Cool. How do I sign out? Sightings as in shadows in the corner of the room, voices being heard, and curtains being flung violently across railings. Horrible stuff. No one ever told me about this room prior to my preceptorship, so it added to everyone's beliefs that it was actually haunted. That comes from Hella Clogged. Again, great name. Even greater story. That's terrifying. Thank you for sharing. The fact that they followed an invisible force with their eyes, that detail there, gave me the most creeps. Thanks for sharing, that's really good. Number 5, a grim plea. This was from a user named Kalasari, and it's about a DNR patient who was on comfort care. They were on a high dose of at the time and they were hallucinating. This is normal, but she would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. Pretty alarming. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure that she was safe. She tried to get up and I went to ask her what she needed, and she grabbed my arm and pulled me down towards her face and said, very angrily mind you, "Kill me." That one messed with me for a while. Yeah, not all these stories have a silver lining. Some of them are just dark and horrible. Welcome to Most Amazing. There you go. This is what you wanted, right? You click the title, there you are. That depressing feeling in your chest, you got it. Click that thumbs up. Let's keep this grim train rolling. Number 4, Paramedic Promise. Okay, that last one was dark, but I promise this one will get your hopes back up for humanity. Uploaded by user Henry RN. Back when I was a paramedic in Oakland, I was taking care of an elderly gentleman in the back of my ambulance. He was looking up into the upper corner of the ambulance and he said, "It's okay, Lulu, I'll be with you soon." Kind of comforting. His daughter was with him and told me later that Lulu was his wife who had died 20 years prior. Now, a few minutes later, he sadly went into cardiac arrest and passed away. Okay, great. That's gives me a little bit of hope for the afterlife, afterworld. Also, I'm terrified at the same time. Isn't that lovely? Thank you for sharing, Henry RN. Henry, right now. That is your real name. Number 3, First Code. This one comes from Falling Star 24. That's a nice name, it's pretty normal. My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. She was ripping her gown off at the time and ripping sheets off the bed, and eventually she yanked off her heart monitor. I was trying to start a blood transfusion at the time, but I needed to get her vitals beforehand, which of course was impossible because she wouldn't stay long enough for any of it to read. I'd given her a sedative and I was praying that it would kick in soon, but she kept grabbing my arm saying, "Come here, look at me, help me," with fear in her eyes that I will obviously never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, "I'm trying," which of course I wish was something comforting now instead. Because then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she closed her mouth and then snapped her eyes wide open, but totally glossed over. And that was it. Again, that is from Falling Star 24. I can't imagine having that unfold in front of you in real life in real time. I wouldn't sleep again. All these stories, like kudos. If you do this job, any of these jobs, can't do it. That's crazy. I'm like saying lists online, I'm talking about these people. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing nothing. This is nothing. Number 2, I Knew It. This comes from username Penguin. Great name. I wanted that one, but you beat me to it. They say, "I'm an ICU nurse. A patient's son rang the hospital at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night saying that he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had had a severe stroke and was doing okay. Recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him and it was a lot of work because he would try and get up, but then he couldn't walk, so he'd fallen a lot. The son really wanted to come in, even though it was way past visiting hours. But you know, I'll bend the rules in a good cause. I figured, what the heck? It's a Saturday night. Come on in and sit with your dad. Of course. I'm like, you're a great person for that also, side note. Sadly, the patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked in the door. It was like a switch was just turned off and he just died like that. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" And I told him at that point, of course not, even though he had some very frustrating behavior because of the stroke. Now the son, of course, at that point just started crying and was screaming, but he started saying, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it," over and over again. How the heck he knew? Well, we were all a little bit freaked out. Now I'm freaked out just after saying that story, so thanks. That makes all of us now. Thanks for sharing. And finally, number 1, not your ring. We'll finish on a scary one that's oddly nice. I don't know, here we go. This one comes from Wacky Detective. There's the wackiest detective out there. They say, when I worked at the funeral home, I was told a story about an elderly lady that had died. The husband said he wanted her to be buried with her ring as she never took it off. My coworker was in the morgue and was washing the body. She removed said ring to mark it down in the paperwork, but as soon as she did, a styrofoam head that they used for wigs went flying across the room. At that point, she just said out loud, all right, I'll put your ring back on. And then she did so. And after that, there were no more disturbances. I mean, it's kind of funny, I don't know. I mean, I would probably faint if that happened to me, but you know, I love how casual your friend was in that scenario. That's what makes it great and gives me hope. Thanks for sharing.
Starting us off at number 10 is Cursed Like a Sailor. One nurse who works in the ICU took to Reddit under the name CABC, posting the weirdest thing a patient ever said to them. They start off by saying, quote, I had a gentleman who was DNR on comfort care. He was demented and was cursing like a sailor. He seemed to have moments of clarity and when asked to see his brothers, who were both dead. Now, that all by itself, not creepy whatsoever. I mean, nurses are definitely used to an array of colorful language, considering how much of their days are spent with people in immense pain. But after a particularly worrisome heart rhythm, his rate started speeding up exponentially, and she began to think that this might be the end. At that moment, Reddit user says, quote, the patient looked at me in the eyes and said, what's your name? To which I replied, my name. He asked, what do you do here? I'm a nurse, I replied. The dying man was quiet for some time, then out of nowhere he just said, F you, and died in silence 20 minutes later. I mean, what was the reason? Coming in at number 9 is Paint the House. Maybe it's just me, but I think the biggest question people have about dying is will they get to see those who have already died wherever it is they are going. It's the whole what really happens to us when we die that likely plagues most of us. So maybe this isn't the darkest on the list, but it's still a bit odd nonetheless. In a post made by a now deleted Reddit account, the nurse explained one of the strangest and simultaneously comforting things they've ever heard. The post said they overheard a conversation between a patient and their grandchild. The grandfather was fading fast, but he turned to his granddaughter and said, quote, Dar, I can't hang around. Your grandma needs me to paint the house. The granddaughter was just about to remind him that her grandma had been dead for several years and there was no house to paint. Then he died right there and then in front of her. The Reddit user claims that while a bit strange, she likes to think that he really was living in his afterlife with his wife painting their house. Next up at number 8, he knew. This one comes from Reddit user Paper Rainbow, and they start off by saying that they came into work for an early shift and were handed over to a patient who had been experiencing high levels of anxiety, including a panic attack the previous evening. Reddit friend continues on saying that all morning the patient had still been quite anxious, but was showing nothing that was concerning and that tests were still coming back fine. So they were merely there to sit with him and make sure he felt okay. But then things started getting weird. The patient starts getting worse, breathing, lying in fetal, and looking like they're on the brink of another panic attack. So the Reddit user tries to reassure them, saying doctors will be here in 10 minutes and to please lie on his back so that they can better monitor his breathing. He refuses, saying, quote, I won't make it until they get here and I won't face the other way. Still, the patient continued to be really agitated, so this time the nurse suggested to move for comfort. That's when he said, quote, I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll be gone. The patient repeated this phrase over and over and over. Then sure enough, as soon as the doctors walked in, he turned to the other side and died. I mean, that can't have just been a coincidence. Coming in at number 7, I understand. In a now deleted Reddit account, one nurse posted saying that although they had heard many strange or concerning last words from a patient, that this one was the creepiest. They started off by explaining that the man was obviously on his deathbed and that they knew he didn't have much time left, as he was experiencing renal failure. Apparently the patient has been pretty quiet for some time, but then all of a sudden his eyes got wide and he loudly yelled, I see a bright light, horses, no eyes, no, no, no. He then fell asleep for a bit, and Reddit user goes on to say that he woke up, looked up, and with his last breath he said, quote, I understand. And he died right at that moment. The user finished off by explaining that, quote, "We know in the medical field that these situations are provoked by a cascade of neurotransmitters in disarray due to tissue and organ failure. But I sometimes have my doubts, and perhaps we are seeing more than we are led to believe." Coming in at number 6 is the Grim Reaper. Hallucinations can apparently be a normal occurrence for patients nearing death due to the high amount of pain meds they're on. But that doesn't mean that what they say still can't haunt you to your core, mostly cause you never really know what the truth is. One Reddit user named Koyena posted about a patient they had had one night that said, quote, "The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God is with you." Then that night, after a horrible and brutal seizure, the man died with his eyes wide open and a creepy grimace plastered across his face. They explained that prior to the seizure, the man had been screaming at the devil in their room and kept shouting over and over, "Get out of here, the building's gonna blow." Now, thank God, nothing actually ever happened to the building, but still, the last thing this person ever said was that they were being haunted by the devil, and then they died with a haunting expression on their face. So definitely unsettling. Coming in at number 5, DNR. Reddit user Kali Asari posted a few years back about one DNR patient they had had that really affected them for a long time after they died. So first off, DNR, if you don't know, stands for Do Not Resuscitate, which means that the patient has opted out of any and all life-saving treatments. Reddit friend starts off by saying, quote, "The patient was on a high dose of morphine and hallucinating. She would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure she was safe. The patient apparently continued trying to get up, so the nurse simply asked, 'What do you need? I'd be happy to get it for you.' To which the woman grabbed her arm, pulled her in close, and said very angrily, quote, 'Kill me.' Safe to say the nurse was expecting her to ask for some water or something. Obviously the nurse did not kill her, but she did die soon after, and that was the last thing she said before she died. Pretty creepy, if you ask me. Coming in at number 4, a confession. Okay, so this one isn't from a nurse, it's actually from a surgeon, but it's really creepy, so I'm still counting it. There is a lot you might expect someone to confess on their deathbed. Cheating scandals, admitting that they hated something or someone, that they were a drug addict, or maybe there was a secret undercover agent. But this story posted to Reddit by the user Really Unbelievable a few years ago honestly sounds like the start of every plot of a true crime doc I've ever heard of. They say, quote, "Not sure if this is creepy, but a man on his deathbed kept repeating, 'The body is in the woods next to the oak tree,' over and over and over again until he passed." Yes, that is creepy, I would say. Was this man confessing to killing someone and hiding the evidence? Apparently police got involved and they ended up searching the area the patient had mentioned but never recovered any evidence of a body. True, it could have been nothing, but that doesn't really seem like something you'd say without any grounds to back it up. Coming in at number 3, hemorrhaging. This next story was by a now deleted Reddit account and might be one of the goriest stories I've ever heard. The patient was hooked up to a trach, which is a tube connected to your neck that helps you breathe when the patient is not able to do so themselves. A Reddit user says, quote, "I walked up to her and saw bright red blood just started shooting up the vent circuit and immediately obstructed it. This wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this, so they turned to the surgeon and explained that the patient was hemorrhaging, to which the doc apparently replied that it was just a little bit of blood, assuming the nurse was referring to the access site in her groin. The nurse knew that there was no time to waste, so they popped off the vent, but it was worse than they had even imagined. Blood started pouring out of her trach, mouth and nose at an exceeding rate until a pool about 6 feet in diameter circled them on the floor and they were covered from chest down. They said after a few minutes the patient used her last bit of strength to look into Reddit user's eyes and just say, quote, "Let me die." Coming in at number 2, fire. As I've mentioned, many nurses or medical staff chalk up strange late-stage behavior to pain meds or a way to cope. But this one story by L_3 had her questioning her own sanity for a few days after. Quote, "I had an old lady flag me down in the hallway a few days before she passed, and with her emaciated face and bulging eyes, she said, 'You know where I'm going.' The nurse asked her what she meant by that, to which she replied, 'You know where I'm going when I die, and it ain't up.' I mean, while it was definitely obscure, our Reddit friend wasn't too freaked out by this point. She simply asked the patient if she would like to see the hospital priest on staff, to which the patient shook her head no and said, "It's too late for that." Then, a few days later, the patient was in bed, eating her dinner, and started screaming. And so the nurse ran in to find her shouting, "Fire, fire, fire! There's fire everywhere." The patient died a few hours later, and the nurse couldn't sleep that night as she was so freaked out that she'd actually witnessed someone seeing the literal fires of hell. And last up in our #1 spot today is Saw the Devil. Posted by Reddit user LolaCSD 6 years ago, they start off by explaining that their patient was a 20-year-old who had previously been a gang member, then ended up diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. The patient was very angry at the universe, which the nurse felt sympathy for, considering how young he was when he was dying, but mentioned that he was an incredibly aggressive and angry young man, often spitting in her or his family's faces and calling just about everyone who spoke to him cruel names. His anger only got worse as his condition progressed, but still his family remained by his side. On his last day, the family called in the nurse to the room as he wasn't responding. His eyes were glossed over, his skin cold, and was barely breathing. His mother, in a last attempt to comfort him, whispered to go towards the light, to Jesus, to which the young man came to and shouted, "F your Jesus." Then the nurse said the next part haunted her for weeks. He then slowly turned his head to the left and got the horrific look on his face, as if he was looking at something we couldn't see. And horrified, like in a bad movie, his face contorted and he screamed with his last breath, eyes wide, "Oh shit, oh shit, oh no!" Then made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. I mean, if that doesn't sound like someone seeing hell, then I don't know what does.
Starting off this list in our #10 spot, we have Kyle's story. This story comes from an officer named Kyle Broadus, and he starts off by explaining that one person who they regularly get calls from is an older woman in her 80s. She struggled with remembering to take her medication, which would often leave her hallucinating that children were in her house and that these children were moving her belongings around and making noise, which is why she was calling the police. So Kyle has been to her house many times for these calls, and one day he was talking to her in the dining room of her home, and he could tell that she was a little annoyed and irritated because she could see the children so vividly, but Kyle obviously couldn't. This is when she looked at him and said with a really concerned tone, "You can't see him? He's been staring at you for 10 minutes now and grinning." And then she pointed to a spot that was only 5 feet away from where Kyle was standing. Kyle said of course he knew it was just her hallucinations, but he said that the way she said it was so creepy, and honestly I can't blame him for feeling like that. I feel like I can just imagine how this scenario went down, and I definitely would have felt the same way. In our #9 spot today we have this OPP story. This story comes from someone whose dad was an Ontario provincial police officer for several years. A while ago he was working a night shift when he heard what no one ever wants to hear, which was someone yelling for help. He did exactly what he's supposed to do and of course went to go and check it out. This is when he gets to the scene and sees an entire house engulfed in flames and a woman standing on the roof yelling for help. This officer was able to climb up the side of the front porch and up a steel rail banister in order to help this woman to safety, but she then informed him that her husband was unfortunately still inside the home. The officer went back up and headed inside the home, but was very sadly unable to get to the man. I'm very glad he was able to hear this woman calling for help and responded so quickly so that he was able to save her life that day. In our #8 spot today we have this strange situation. This story comes from the redditor Muskmelon12, and they are a police officer. They responded to a call one night around 3 a.m. to a woman who was potentially going to harm herself. Muskmelon12 and their partner find this woman's apartment and knock on the door, which slowly creaks open to a pitch black apartment. They identify themselves as police and say that they're coming in. As they get further in, they see candles lit in a room near the back, so they head towards that room. When they enter the room, they see a woman sitting on the edge of her bed, and she is kicking her legs around like crazy and is whispering to herself and shaking her head back and forth. The officer notices that the bedside table is stacked full of Virgin Mary figurines, and the walls are covered in sketches of upside upside down crosses. The officer says, "Ma'am, this is the police," and that's when she snaps her head towards them with a wrinkled face and says, "You can't help me. The devil has me." Yeah, this officer said that they didn't sleep for the rest of the night after their shift, and I truly can't blame them one little bit. In our number 7 spot today, we have this runaway story. This story comes from an officer who was responding to the call of a teenager who had run away. Both the parents in this house were teachers, and they had 2 daughters, one of which was the person that they would soon be looking for. I believe everything with the daughter who ran away turned out completely fine, but surprisingly, that is actually not what this story is about. As this officer is taking a report and getting statements from the family in the living room, the one daughter yells, "Grandma!" After this, the dad goes running into the hallway as he yells, "Mom! Mom!" Shortly after this, the dad returns to the living room with everyone else and asks the officer, "Did you see her? Did you see my mother?" The officer responded that he had not seen her and asked why everyone was so excited that she had walked down the hallway, and the dad replied, "She died last year. We see her walking around the house all the time." It's safe to say that the officer probably finished the report outside of the home instead. In our number 6 spot today, we have these 911 calls. This story comes from a 911 dispatch about a very spooky story that they just cannot seem to forget. An elderly woman in the town's husband had passed away previously, and this woman was showing some signs of dementia. She began to call 911 often to ask for help with really mundane tasks that 911 usually doesn't help with, but of course they always responded. This woman believed she was calling her husband for help doing things like turning the thermostat up or helping her boil some water. So one day after this has been going on for a while, 911 gets the call and hears her say, "John, I need your help." The officers respond and unfortunately find her passed away, but the weird thing is, she had been gone for a lot longer than the minutes it took them to respond to the call. They just thought it was weird and carried on, but then for months afterwards, 911 continued to get calls and would hear her voice on the other end saying, "John, I need your help," and of course the officers have to respond every time, and they always found an empty house. Even the phone line had been disconnected, so who knows how these calls were still coming through. In our number 5 spot today, we have this possession story. This story comes from an officer named Meredith who was working in dispatch at the time, and it starts off with the family calling 911 saying that their daughter had been possessed. The family explained that there was no history of any substance abuse or mental illness that would cause this sort of behavior, which is why they believed that it was possession. Apparently family members were holding the woman down, and Meredith could hear 2 people yelling at each other in the background. Meredith asked the person on the phone to tell whoever was yelling at the possessed woman to stop yelling, to which the caller replied, "It's her." Meredith said that she knew that the woman was yelling, but whoever was yelling back at her should stop, and the caller said, "No, it's her, both of the voices." Meredith was absolutely shocked and could not believe what she was hearing. She said she could distinctly hear a woman yelling and an adult male yelling back. She also said that both voices were screaming in a different language that she couldn't understand, but that she absolutely knew it was 2 totally different voices. Meredith said it made her skin crawl, and she has never been able to forget that day. In our number 4 spot today, we have this abandoned hospital story. This story takes place in an abandoned hospital, of course, at nighttime. The city had built a new hospital, and this one had just been totally abandoned, leaving everything in place, even half-drank coffee mugs. This officer was at the hospital and found himself having to turn off lights he swore he had turned off already. He was doing rounds of all of the floors when he heard footsteps above him. He took the elevator up, which I'm kind of surprised by, but as he's in the elevator, he can hear talking and giggling that gets louder as he goes up. I personally would have been out of the building already if I heard that, but of course this officer needs to continue checking everything out so that he can ensure the building is clear. After he gets off the elevator, he searches the floor high and low but can't seem to find anything. Just as he's getting back on the elevator, all of the lights on the floor turned back on behind him. I honestly don't know how he continued to go back there after that day, because I certainly would not have. I know this one wasn't necessarily haunting words and more like haunting sounds, but I definitely feel like in this case it still applies. In our number 3 spot today, we have this idling car story. This one's crazy. This story comes from a Reddit user who is explaining a really crazy story that came from their dad, who was a police officer for 25 years. One night as he is patrolling around, he sees a car that is idling at a stop sign, so he goes over to check out what's going on and make sure that everything is okay. As he's walking up to the car, he sees that the windows are covered in blood, which is just never a good sign or what you want to see. He opens the driver's side door where he finds a man sitting in the driver's seat. This man of course has a lot of blood on him as well, and he is holding a sharp object. The officer asks the man if he's okay, and this guy says back to the officer, "I couldn't stop the buzzing sound, so I cut my ears off." I truly couldn't imagine how anyone could stay calm in this situation, but the officer of course did, and the ambulance arrived shortly after in order to help this injured man. That is definitely on the list of things I wouldn't have suspected an officer to hear on duty, but I'm very glad that this officer stopped and that this guy was able to receive the help and medical attention that he needed. In our number 2 spot today we have John's story. This story starts off with a family calling 911 because a guy in the family, who we'll call John, is having some sort of psychiatric episode. They arrive at the home and John is in his room rocking back and forth, and there is blood smeared all over the walls, which would be absolutely frightening. They explain that it honestly looked like a scene from a horror movie. They call John's name a few times, trying to get him to look over at them and respond. Finally, John stops rocking back and forth, glances at them, and then back at the ground. This is when they walk over to John to try and get him to an ambulance, and they say, "Alright John, time to go," and without missing a single beat in what they described as the most demonic sounding voice they've ever heard, John responded with, "John's not here anymore." This whole thing honestly sounds like it came straight out of a horror movie, because that would be absolutely terrifying. There wasn't any follow-up to this story unfortunately, but I truly hope John was able to get the help that he needed that day. In our number 1 spot today we have this dying declaration story. This story comes from a police officer on Reddit who goes by the username LXIV. This story comes from a time when he was responding to a call where a woman had unfortunately been hurt very badly. As he arrives at the scene, the victim is really struggling and he is trying to keep her stable until the paramedics arrive. So there is a law in court that you can't testify on behalf of a witness and explain what they said that they saw. The witness has to testify themselves. One of the only exceptions to this is if the witness passes away or believes that they are about to pass away, but they were able to give the details of the event in their final moments before passing. Then the person who heard these words is allowed to testify on their behalf. I hope that made sense. So, this officer is trying to keep this woman stable, but really feels like it doesn't look good for her. This officer needed to confirm that this woman believed she was about to pass away in order to be able to testify to her dying declaration, so he asked her 2 questions. The first of which was, who hurt her, which she answered, and then the second was, do you realize that you may be about to die? At this point their eyes locked and she responded, yes. You guys, I know it's just one word, but I can't imagine being in that situation. Luckily, this story has a very happy ending though, as the woman actually ended up surviving and the person who hurt her was caught without anyone getting injured further, which is just the best news to this very eerie story.
Coming in number 10, we have When You Know You Know. Let's kick off this one with Reddit user Through the Shades. This person has been working in a hospital for a long time. They'd encountered thousands of patients, some of them very dramatic, and some of them came in calm and focused. There was one day when someone was brought in to the emergency and they were in some pretty rough shape, but for some reason they had the most relaxed composure that they had ever seen on a patient. This person needed a tourniquet on right away and they were losing a lot of blood. Right when our Reddit user doctor was applying this tourniquet, the patient looked at them and said, "I'm dying." In that moment they watched their eyes closed and they passed away. Through the Shades wrote that they could always tell who really knew they were going to die and who didn't. Some people would just be screaming "I'm dying" because they were panicking and scared about what was going to happen to them, but this person knew that their time was coming and they calmly moved on to whatever comes after we die. That must have been one of the most frightening and exhilarating moments of their life. I mean, I don't want to die anytime soon, but it would be cool to find out the answer to one of life's biggest mysteries. Coming in number 9, we have the body. Reddit user Really Unbelievable said that they were a surgeon and responded to to a question on Reddit asking what was the craziest thing that doctors have heard before patients died. Now, because this guy's Reddit name is really unbelievable, it's gonna make this one a little harder to believe, but I'm not here to snoop through everyone's Reddit profile to find out if they were actually a surgeon. I'm here to bring you the craziest stuff I can find. So this doctor wrote that they were in the room with a patient and he was on his deathbed. He was about to go and he kept saying there's a body behind the oak tree over and over again. Of course, this was a very creepy thing to say as you're dying. I don't think someone who's about to say goodbye to the land of the living would be keen on pulling one last prank. Or they would, I have no idea what it feels like to die. But in these final moments, those words shocked everyone in the room, and the police came in to get some information, but not before the man died. So they took those few words and then launched a small search behind the man's house. There was a wooded area, and even though there were a few oak trees, nothing substantial was found. So maybe this guy was just messing with everyone, or maybe he was telling the truth but didn't have enough strength to give them all the details. Coming at number 8, we have Where's My Dog? Okay, now we have a really sad one for you, so you better grab some tissues because this one is a tearjerker. Reddit user XTexanPrideX wrote in about a time they had someone rushed into the emergency because they were in a serious car accident. The person who was brought into the emergency had one of their arms ripped off and he was losing blood very fast. It was pretty clear that this guy wasn't going to make it. His blood pressure was dropping too fast, but right before he passed out, he asked if his dog was okay. See, his dog had been in the car with him when he was in the crash, and all he wanted to know was if his dog was okay. The doctor didn't answer him because he didn't want to cause him any more stress because his dog didn't survive the crash. It wasn't long after the question that he passed out and then passed on. I guess one can hope that when he got up to the pearly gates, his good boy was waiting for him there. I told you, this was a sad one. Coming in at number 7, we have Dad's last words. Now this one doesn't come from a doctor, but it happened in a hospital, and it was someone's last words, so it's pretty much what we're looking for here. Reddit user Artsy Fartsy talked about when their father was in the hospital with lung cancer. His dad lived a long life and was around 80 now, but he hadn't always treated his body the best. He was a smoker for most of his life, and when he got older, all of that caught up with him. A Reddit user talked about how his father was a foot soldier in World War II, and when he would tell old stories about the war, he said he would always talk about how he used to sing this song. Show me the way home, I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a drink about an hour ago and it went straight to my head. I can see how that would be a hit while you're marching during the war. Well, while his dad was on his deathbed, he was in and out of consciousness in the hospital. He was very sick and they had him on a lot of medication. Well, a Reddit user said that he managed to come to for long enough to sing that song one final time before he passed. Those were the last words he ever said. Coming at number 6, we have How Does It Happen? Reddit user JL Blessing Jr. talked about the time they were working in a hospital and they had a patient who was very sick. They were in the late stages of cancer and they knew they weren't going to make it very much longer. This patient turned to them and said, "How do I die?" And that was the last thing they said before they passed away. I mean, if you're in that situation as a doctor and you have someone say that to you, how do you even answer it? It seems like such a difficult thing to respond to. Do you tell them what's actually going to happen to their body and how they're going to pass on to the other side? Or do you tell them something sweet so they feel at ease? Of course, you don't want to make this person more afraid of death than they probably already are, but at the same time, do you want to lie to someone who's about to die? Coming in at number 5, we have You Know What's Coming. Sometimes you can have a premonition about your own life. You get a gut feeling and you don't know why, but there's something telling you a hint from the future. Who knows what that is, but we have a pretty interesting moment of it in our next story. Reddit user Pizza with Artichoke talked about a time they were about to perform surgery on a patient. It was someone with an infected heart valve from drug use. That is something I didn't even know could happen. They should tell you that when they're trying to get kids not to do drugs. Well, the patient was laying on their bed and they hadn't fed them the anesthesia yet. The guy sat up and said, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" Apparently he had been through a couple of these surgeries before and the chance of surviving the next one was pretty low. He died on the table during the surgery. That's a wild story and it brings up the question, did he see his future and know he was going to die? Or did he convince himself that he was going to die and because of that, it increased his chances of dying on the table? And if you think I have the answer to this question, you guys are dead wrong. I make top 10 lists. Coming at number 4, we have Hey Angel. A Reddit user who deleted their account said that they used to work in a hospital and they would have to go to the ICU quite often. There was one patient who they would see all the time and for the most part they would have a casual conversation. Then one day they seemed a little off. He looked at her and said, "Hey Angel." This was very strange because he had never called her Angel before. After that he just laid back and went to sleep. Later that night he passed away. What was so weird about this was when he said Angel, it seemed like he wasn't looking right at her. It was like he was looking behind her, but there was no one there. This could have been a hallucination from someone who's about to pass on? I mean, when your body's getting ready to go, you can have some pretty wild things happen to your mind. But what if he really saw something there? What if there was someone waiting to take him to the other side? Coming in at number 3, we have What a Way to Go. Alright, here's one that's a little bit more of a warmer story compared to the other ones on this list. Reddit user Cinderella talked about a story her dad told her from being a doctor. He was a doctor in an inner city hospital, and they would get a lot of people who had substance abuse problems. One day a guy came in who was there quite often and was also known for being extremely rude to the nurses and doctors. This time when the guy came in, he was in the worst shape he'd ever been in. His lungs were full of pneumonia and his heart was in even worse shape than that. He was in a room by himself, and our Reddit user Dr. Dad saw on one of the monitors that he was having an irregular heartbeat. So he walked into the patient's room and stood in the doorway. He asked the dude how he was feeling and he said, "With my hands, you jerk off." And then he died right after that. I mean, that's one hell of a line to go out on. Coming in at number 2, we have By Yourself. British guy ESQ wrote on Reddit about how he was working as a doctor and he had a patient who was quite a bit older and very sick. The guy had stage 4 lung cancer and there was no chance of him beating it, so it was only a matter of time before he passed on. This patient had a feeling that he was going to pass that night, and he asked our Reddit user doctor if he could sit with him that night. See, the old dude had no family and he was there all by himself and was dying alone. The guy just didn't want to die alone, and there was no way our Reddit user was going to let that happen. The last thing the old man said before he passed on was thank you. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have a kiss. Our final one today comes from Reddit user Quacaro. They were working as a doctor and they had one patient who was dying from brain cancer. Something they would have to do is come in and speak loudly to him to see if he was conscious or not. It was something that our doctor didn't like to do, so they asked his wife if she would do it. She kindly obliged. One day they were doing this routine check and the doctor came in and the wife started speaking loudly to him to see if he was conscious. In that moment, he took her hand and kissed it and then passed away. Not final words, but as clear a message as anyone could ever send.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Alexander Prokorenko. In 2016, Alexander was a senior lieutenant with the Special Armed Forces of the Russian Armed Forces. He was 25 years old at the time and was fighting in the Syrian civil war. On March 17th of 2016, during the Palmyra offensive, he found himself surrounded by ISIS militants. Not wanting to be captured alive and also bravely doing what he thought was best, he ordered an airstrike on his location. His command was slightly confused in the beginning of this order and asked him to confirm his order, and that is when Alexander spoke his final words to command. He said, quote, "They're outside. This is the end, Commander. Thank you. Tell my family and my country I love them. Tell them I was brave and I fought until I could no longer. Please take care of my family. Avenge my death. Goodbye, Commander. Tell my family I love them." Alexander left behind his wife Katya and the child that they were expecting at the time of his death. He was nicknamed the Russian Rambo after his death and was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation for his ultimate sacrifice. In our number 9 spot today, we have Michael Ney. Michael was the first Duke of Elchingen and was the first Prince of Moskva and was a French military commander in the French Revolutionary Wars as well as the Napoleonic Wars. He was even one of the original 18 marshals of the empire that Napoleon I created. After Napoleon was dethroned and exiled in 1815, however, Michael was arrested and tried by the Chamber of Peers for treason. When the verdict was given, 137 peers voted for the death penalty, 17 voted for deportation, 5 abstained, and there was 1 single vote for acquittal. Unfortunately, this was a majority rule situation and Michael was sentenced to death by the firing squad. On December 7th, 1815, Michael was put in front of a firing squad and he refused to wear a blindfold. He was surprisingly given the right to order the fire himself, and before doing so, these are the final words that he spoke. Quote, "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order, it will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France and not one against her. Soldiers, fire." I couldn't imagine having to be the one to order your own death, especially when you don't want to die, so this one definitely leaves quite an eerie feeling. In our number 8 spot today, we have Gregorio del Pilar. Gregorio was a general of the Philippine Revolutionary Army during the Philippine-American War and is known for being one of the youngest generals in the Revolutionary Army at just the young age of 22 years old. He was nicknamed Boy General and was also known for being quite a ladies' man. In 1896, Gregorio finished his Bachelor of Arts and was going on to complete more education, but when the revolution broke out, he enlisted himself for military service. In 1899, the Americans were advancing on the Tirade Pass, and this is the battle that unfortunately was Gregorio's last. He was sadly shot in the neck and died almost instantly. While his last spoken words weren't recorded, it was his final diary entry that I want to talk about today. His final entry read, quote, "The general has given me the pick of all the men that can be spared and ordered me to defend the pass. I realize what a terrible task has been given to me, and yet I felt that this is the most glorious moment of my life. What I do is done for my beloved country. No sacrifice can be too great." It obviously shows how incredibly dedicated he was to his country, and perhaps he had some sort of inkling that this battle just may be his last. At the end of the day, his legacy certainly lives on. In our number 7 spot today, we have Murray Hudson. Murray Hudson was born in 1938 and was a sergeant with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. On February 13th, 1974, Murray was a drill instructor and was supervising a training exercise when things took a really dark turn. One of the officers in training, or a non-commissioned officer who was participating in this training exercise, accidentally armed a grenade that he was about to throw. This is obviously an incredibly frightening situation, and one that made the officer completely freeze. After all, what do you really do in that situation? Murray saw him freeze and realized what had happened and ordered him to throw it, which I guess is the smartest move and the only thing that you can do. The officer unfortunately was still frozen and wasn't reacting, so in an attempt to save him, Murray went over and took his hand and tried to release the grenade so that he could throw it. During this process, the grenade unfortunately exploded, which took both of their lives. The final words of Murray were his directions and him saying, "Throw it. Just throw it." Such a tragic event that absolutely could have been avoided. Murray was awarded the George Cross after his passing, which is the highest award bestowed by the British government for gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. In our number 6 spot today, we have Sanada Yukimura. During the Warring States period in Japan, there was one incredibly famous samurai warrior. Sanada Yukimura, whose real name was Sanada Nobushige, was an incredible fighter and is best known for being the leading general on the defending side of the siege of Osaka. Sanada is known as a hero and has even been called the #1 hero in Japan. Unfortunately, the summer siege of Osaka Castle was his last, where his haunting last words come from. He ended up being mortally struck, and this is when he stumbled out onto the field while removing his helmet. This is when he said the words, quote, "I am Sanada Nobushige, no doubt an adversary quite worthy of you, but I am exhausted and can fight no longer. Go on. Take my head as your trophy." These truly might be some of the coolest last words ever, and that is sincerely a reflection of the type of warrior he was. In our number 5 spot today, we have Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born in November of 1554 and was an English poet and soldier, and is one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan era. In 1586, he joined Sir John Norris in the Battle of Zutphen in the fight against the Spanish, but it was during this battle that he was shot in the thigh, which would ultimately lead to his death. One of the most well-known stories about Sir Philip Sidney is when he was lying wounded next to another soldier who was also wounded. He spoke his last words to the other soldier when he was giving him his water. He said, "Take it. Thy need is greater than mine." It seems as though he must have known that he was about to pass, but it also shows the kind of person he was, which seems to be a very noble person. He certainly left a legacy, considering we are still here talking about him today. In our number 4 spot today, we have John Sedgwick. John was born in 1813 and was a military officer and Union Army general during the American Civil War. On May 9th, 1864, he and his men were at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and he was directing different placements when Confederate sharpshooters, who were around 1,000 yards away, began shooting at them. This of course caused for some of John's men to duck for cover like any regular human being would when being shot at. I'm not exactly sure why, but John seemed to have been less concerned with the shots and more concerned with the soldiers taking cover, and he continued to strut around and said, quote, "I am ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." It was unfortunately just a few moments later that he was fatally struck by a bullet just under his left eye. His chief of staff, Martin T. McMahon, was close to him and heard his last words and tried to catch him as he fell. Medical personnel were of course called as quickly as possible, but unfortunately he never regained consciousness. In our number 3 spot today, we have Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne. Henri was a French general who has gone down in history as one of the greatest military commanders in modern history. During the Dutch War in the summer campaign in Salzburg on July 27th, 1675, Henri was struck by one of the first shots. I believe it was also a cannonball, so it was just really not a good scene. He laid on the ground, barely able to breathe, when he uttered his last words, which were, quote, "I did not mean to be killed today." Aside from that being very honest, it's also quite sad. I always like to picture people's final moments as peaceful or just hope that they have no idea what's happening, but this was of course not the case for him. After his passing, when his death was announced, people all over were mourning the loss as he was an incredibly well-respected man. In our number 2 spot today we have Jan Žižka. Jan is a hero in Czech and was lovingly nicknamed One-Eyed Žižka after he lost one and then both eyes during battle. He is still regarded as one of the most prominent military leaders despite living so long ago, which certainly is quite a legacy. There was quite a bit of time during his life where he and his men were fighting against King Sigismund, who is the king of Bohemia. Jan didn't end up passing away in battle, however. He actually died of the plague in 1492. After his passing, his men called themselves orphans because they felt like they had lost their father, and if that doesn't speak to the kind of leader he was, this next bit definitely will. It has been recorded that his last words were, quote, "Make my skin into drumheads for the Bohemian cause." While kind of gross in thought, I think it definitely shows his commitment and passion and how he wanted to lead his men into battle any way he could, even after his passing. In our number 1 spot today we have Maynard L. Beamy Beamsdorfer. Maynard was a World War II hero who luckily went on to live a very long life after his duty was over. He ended up passing away at the age of 92, and really, who could be upset at making it that far in life, especially when you survived such a high-risk job? He passed away in 2016 and was thankfully surrounded by his family, which truly makes his death one of the most pleasant on this list, which I am very glad about. His final words spoken to his family were, quote, "Did I do good?" I think that is both very sweet and quite sad at the same time. It's wonderful that he was able to be around family, and I am certain they assured him that he did, in fact, do very good. I hope in his final moments he really did feel proud of himself, and I hope when he slipped away, he knew the answer to his question.
Starting us off at number 10, Sister Leticia Lopez. In the 90s, Sister Luz Granada was a well-known nun in Bogota, Colombia, who focused much of her work on aiding sex workers and addicts in the community. So when her mutilated body was found one day, shot, dismembered, and badly burned on the side of the road in a high-risk area, authorities initially assumed that the perpetrator had been one of the addicts or workers she was helping. They were, however, completely wrong. Sister Leticia Lopez was another nun that worked with Sister Granada. However, Sister Lopez reportedly openly looked down on Granada for the kind of people that she chose to help and associate with. And as it turns out, she was actually the one who committed the atrocity. In 2002, after being previously acquitted for the crime, the FBI became involved and discovered traces of blood in Sister Lopez's room that matched the late Sister Granada's, and she was ultimately sentenced to 14 years behind bars. Not only that, it's believed Lopez was a part of some kind of vigilante group responsible for the death of another 21 escorts and addicts in the area, which is certainly a breach of vows to say the least. Coming in at number 9, a lawsuit. It's not incredibly often that we find nuns tangled in the legal system, especially with a celebrity, but that is exactly what happened in 2015. What happened was Katy Perry had arranged and agreed to buy a former convent property from the LA Archdiocese that was for sale for $14.5 million. However, the deal ended up turning a bit sour after 2 nuns became involved. The nuns, Sister Catherine Rose and Sister Rita Callanan, got news of the deal and began to make a fuss over someone that they viewed as too provocative due to her songs like I Kissed a Girl and You're So Gay. Katy tried to rectify the situation by visiting the nuns, but even after singing a hymn to them and reportedly showing her tattoo of Jesus, they remained unconvinced. And that is when things got messy. The nuns decided to go behind the Catholic Archdiocese's back and privately sell the property to a restaurateur for more money. Now, the extremely wild part of this is that prior to a decision in court, one of the nuns actually died in the courtroom just hours after being interviewed by Fox 11 and pleading with Katy Perry to stop, which is just an insane series of events. In the end, Katy ended up winning the legal battle as the judge ruled that the nuns had no legal grounds to sell the property without the consent of the archbishop and the Vatican. Coming in at number 8, Lucia of Fatima. Born in 1907, Sister Fatima rose to fame at the age of 10 after allegedly bearing witness to the Virgin Mary's apparition. Now, at first, her family assumed she was lying and often punished her for saying such things. However, she continued to insist that on the 13th of every month, the Holy Mother would visit her and tell her visions of the future. And eventually, she was believed after her visions appeared to be coming true. The first of the visions was a depiction of hell as told by the Virgin Mary, according to Sister Fatima. However, the second vision was what really scared the public. She revealed that while World War I will end, it would soon be followed by another great war after the death of Pope Pius VI. Something that turned out to be true. As we all know, there was indeed a Second World War that began in September of 1939, and Pope Pius ended up dying in February of 1939. So, I mean, that is definitely a strange coincidence. Now, as far as the third secret she allegedly received from the Virgin Mary, Sister Fatima said that the final battle between God and the kingdom of Satan will be about family and marriage, so it's a little more vague, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see if her vision becomes more clear as time goes on. Coming in at number 7, demon nuns. In 1632, the Ursuline convent faced major concern after it appeared that all 17 of the nuns presiding inside claimed to have been possessed by a demonic entity. The demon in question was allegedly Asmodai, and the nuns of the convent say he was sent to commit evil and imprudent acts with them. As is recorded, the nuns were found convulsing, screaming, and barking, among other strange activities, and despite the priest Father Grandier's best interventions to exorcise the demons, the nuns remained haunted by the entity. However, things took a turn when the nuns began accusing the priest of being the one who summoned the demons in the first place. In the end, the court decided that the priest had made some kind of pact with the devil that allowed for the nuns to be possessed, and he was burned at the stake for his alleged witchcraft. Coming in at number 6, Sister Josefa Mendez. During her short life as a nun, Sister Mendez claims she was taken to see hell multiple times, and while she was initially very reluctant to write about the horrors she witnessed and experienced firsthand, eventually she came around to honor her Lord's wishes. The experiences she wrote about in her journal were terrifying, but the surprising point that she often repeated was that a lot of the torment surrounded the soul's inability to love. In fact, she wrote that one of those damned souls cried out, "This is my torture, that I want to love and cannot. There is nothing left for me but hatred and despair. If one of us could so much as make a single act of love, but we cannot. We live on hatred." As far as the torture she endured, she wrote, "My soul fell into abysmal depths, the bottom of which cannot be seen, for it is immense. Then I was pushed into one of those fiery cavities and pressed, as it were, between two burning planks, and sharp nails and red-hot iron seemed to be piercing my flesh. I felt as if they were endeavoring to pull out my tongue, but could not. This torture reduced me to such agony that my very eyes seemed to be starting out of their sockets." That is merely one of her entries on one visit. According to some of her last confessions, she was sent hundreds of times and claimed in her final entry that "all I have written is but a shadow of what the soul suffers, for no words can express such dire torments." Coming in at number 5, Sister Luc Gabrielle. In 1959, after years of declaring she would grow up to be a nun, Jean-Paul Marie Deckers joined a convent in Belgium and took on the name of Sister Luc Gabrielle. However, only a few years later, in 1962, her life changed forever after her fellow sisters convinced her to record and publish her music. By 1963, she had made #1 on music charts with her song Dominique, and the following year she landed a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show and gained notoriety as the singing nun. Tragically, however, the following years were difficult, and eventually she felt her two worlds were too different, and so Sister Gabrielle eventually felt forced to leave the convent in 1966. After leaving the convent, she was told she could no longer call herself the singing nun and was forced to change her stage name. Despite this, she remained a practicing Catholic, but challenged many thoughts of the church. She was speculated to be gay and released a song in favor of birth control, among other things. However, her career never really flourished. Tragically, as the years went by, Jean-Paul's mental health declined until in 1985, both her and her lifelong partner Annie Pechet took their lives together. In their final note, they requested to be buried by a Catholic church as they had remained faithful followers until their final day. I mean, honestly, this one might be more sad than horrifying, but still. Coming in at number 4, Sister Marie Inconnue. I guess this one is technically more of a lack of a confession. However, the result is truly horrifying nonetheless. According to a legend that dates back to the 18th century, there once was a nun named Sister Marie who requested she be transferred from France to Canada during the Acadian and British conflicts to help the Acadian people in eastern Canada. It's said that Sister Marie was a devoted nun loved by all in the village, and that she was in charge of protecting a large sum of money that was intended to be used for assisting people in the community. And so, as the story goes, she decided to bury the money in order to make sure no one could ever steal it from her. However, one night after returning home late from assisting an ill villager, she was attacked by a group of sailors demanding to know where she had buried the money. Sister Marie refused to disclose the location she had hidden it, and as a result was viciously beheaded by the men. The next morning, the village was horrified to find their beloved nun dead in the street, but still her body was sent back to France to be laid to rest. Her head, however, was never found. Now modern day New Brunswick, it said she still haunts the area, and some claim to have seen a headless apparition asking them to help her find their head. Coming in at number 3, Sister Maria Gomez. A few years back in 2011, the Catholic Church in Spain went through a series of major allegations involving an underground adoption ring, and let me tell you, this one is a doozy. In short, what allegedly happened dates as far back as the early 1950s, and members of the Catholic Church, one of whom is believed to be Sister Maria Gomez, were illegally selling off newborns in exchange for massive sums of money. To make matters worse, it's suspected there have been around 2,000 cases of this, and the ring that Sister Gomez was allegedly involved in would reportedly lie to mothers and tell them that their new little bundle hadn't survived labor, present them with a decoy so that they could see they were not alive, and then sell off the real person to adoptive families. I mean, it's diabolical. Apparently, several parents came forward on their deathbeds confessing to their now adult sons and daughters the truth of how they acquired them, and many got DNA tests to confirm what they hoped would not be true. But sadly, their parents, who turned out to be their adoptive parents, were telling the truth. To date, the only person to be charged for the crime is Sister Maria Gomez, but there are sure to be countless others involved in the scandal. Coming in at number 2, Maria Monk. Author of the 1836 novel Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, Monk became a well-known, if not blacklisted public figure after the release of her book. In it, she claimed that she experienced horrifying treatment under the priests at her convent that, if true, would be one of the most horrible things I could imagine. Allegedly, according to Maria, the nuns of her Montreal convent were forced and coerced into engaging intimately with the priests from the seminary next door, who would allegedly sneak into the convent through a secret underground tunnel. Now, here is where it gets even more messed up. Maria claims that if the union resulted in a new human being being brought into the world, that it would be baptized and then killed before being hidden in the basement, and that any uncooperative nun simply disappeared. Now, the thing with this confession is that it is largely believed by scholars to be a hoax, but also there isn't any definitive proof, so it could very well be just as terrifying as it sounds. And last up in our number 1 spot, Sister Godfrida. Also known as Cecile Bombeek, Sister Godfrida was a Catholic nun who devoted herself to the convent at age 15. Soon after she joined, she found her calling working with the elderly, and for decades she lived an uneventful life. That was until the 1970s, when 3 other nuns contacted the police after they noticed something strange going on in the nursing home. For a while, the nuns had been keeping a log of the patients, the now Mother Superior dealt with, but they noticed that she strangely had a suspiciously high death rate among her patients. As it turns out, Dear Mother Superior had a nasty habit and didn't actually like working with old people as much as she let on. Along with stealing around $30,000 from her elderly patients, Sister Godfrida eventually confessed to killing 3 patients with a fatal dose of insulin, claiming that they were too difficult to care for at night. Once they were dead, she stole their belongings to support her addiction, and while she only confessed to 3 killings, authorities have reason to believe she took the lives of as many as 30 people.
In our number 10 spot, we have Spencer Perceval. Spencer was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland before his assassination in 1812. At 5:15 p.m. on May 11th of that year, Spencer was on his way to an inquiry and was passing through the House of Commons when a man drew a pistol and shot Spencer in the chest. As Spencer fell to the floor, he uttered his last words, which were murder and oh my god. It's super scary that in his final moments he was realizing what had happened to him, which was obviously terrible. By the time a surgeon arrived just a few minutes later after the shooting, Spencer's pulse was already gone and he was pronounced dead. In our number 9 spot today, we have Getulio Vargas. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button because it really helps us out. Vargas was the president of Brazil for a few different periods of time. From 1930 to 1934, he was interim president. In 1934, he was constitutional president until 1937, and from then until 1945, he was actually a dictator. Vargas actually ended up taking his own life in the end on August 24th, 1954. Since no one was around when he did it, his last spoken words aren't recorded, but he did leave a note behind for his son, who was the one who found him. Part of the note read as, "Nothing remains except my blood. Now I gave you my life, now I give you my death." This is honestly very eerie, and I think it really reflects the kind of mental state he was in at the time of his death. In our number 8 spot today, we have King George IV. King George IV was the King of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Ireland from 1820 to 1830. King George hasn't necessarily been praised for being a good king or person, really, but that is not what we are here to talk about today. King George was a heavy drinker and lived an extremely indulgent lifestyle that led to some pretty extreme health conditions. Because of his poor health, in the years before his death, he was almost entirely bedridden and suffered from bouts of breathlessness. He went almost entirely blind from cataracts and had such bad gout that he couldn't even sign documents because his arm and hand were so sore. King George passed away on the morning of June 26, 1830, and while his last words have been disputed, they were somewhere along the lines of, "Oh God, I am dying, this is death." I know he wasn't a great dude, but it is still pretty sad to think of someone dying in such pain. After his death, it was discovered that he had died due to upper gastrointestinal bleeding that was caused due to a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach. But he also had a large tumor in his bladder, and his heart was enlarged with calcified valves. So all in all, he was an extremely unwell guy. In our number 7 spot, we have Albert I of Belgium. Albert I was the King of Belgium from 1909 to 1934 during quite an interesting time for the country. He really focused on his subjects and was honestly a pretty well-respected king. He passed away in 1934 after a mountaineering accident. On February 17th of that year, while climbing the side of a difficult cliff, he ended up unfortunately falling to his death. He was 58 years old at the time, and speculations began to swirl about what exactly happened since he was alone at the time of his passing. Since he was alone, his exact last words are likely unknown, but these are some of the last words he spoke to the last person he saw before the accident. "If I feel in good form, I shall take the difficult way up. If I do not, I shall take the easy one. I shall join you in an hour." While this sentence is fairly normal, it's pretty dark knowing what we know now. He really had no idea how close he was to his death. In our number 6 spot today, we have James Monroe. James was the 5th President of the United States from March of 1817 to March of 1825. While James isn't regarded as a necessarily bad president, he did have slaves and owned a pretty large plantation, so I'm gonna go ahead and just deem him as not that great of a guy. He ended up passing away at the age of 73 on July 4th, 1831, of heart failure and tuberculosis. His last words were, "I regret that I should leave this world without beholding him again." The him he was talking about was his best friend's James Madison. This is kind of cute, but also very sad. The pair had actually had a falling out after many years of friendship, which really just adds a little insult to injury on that one. In our number 5 spot today, we have Francisco Solano Lopez. Francisco Solano Lopez was the second president of Paraguay from 1862 until he passed away on March 1st, 1870. He was a really controversial president as people blamed him for the outbreak of the Paraguayan War. He actually ended up dying in another war. He was offered his life if he surrendered, but he refused and still tried to fight back. His final words were, "I die for my homeland." He really ended up making the greatest sacrifice he could. It's just really sad that things had to end that way. In our number 4 spot today, we have Lal Bahadur Shastri. Lal was the second Prime Minister of India from June of 1964 until January of 1966. He was a leader who really tried his best not to mix religion with politics, and honestly lived his life trying to be a servant to the public as best as possible. He ended up passing away just one day after signing the treaty to end the Indo-Pakistan War. While it was released that he died from cardiac arrest, people have since speculated that it was a cover-up and that foul play was actually involved. His final words were, "O Father, O Rama." Rama is a deity in Hinduism and is the 7th avatar of the god Vishnu. Assuming that he really did die from cardiac arrest, I just really hope he wasn't calling out for the name of his gods because he was in pain. In our number 3 spot, we have George V. George V was the King of the United Kingdom from 1910 to 1936 when he passed away. He wasn't originally supposed to be king, but in 1892 his older brother ended up passing away unexpectedly, which put him in line for the throne just after his father. He ended up taking over the role once his father had passed. For the last few years of his life, he ended up falling quite ill, and after his favorite sister passed away, he fell into a deep depression, which definitely didn't help his health at all. His last words were, "God damn you," which he said to his nurse as she injected him with a sedative. This is dark because his doctor actually admitted to giving him drugs that would speed up his dying process. He was certainly already on his deathbed, but it's pretty freaky that he was basically forced into dying sooner, and I feel like he knew what was going on considering his rude language to his nurse. I don't know about you guys, but this one feels pretty suspicious. In our number 2 spot today, we have Harold Holt. Harold was the 17th Prime Minister of Australia until his death in 1967. In December of that year, Harold was with 4 other people when he convinced everyone to stop at Cheviot Beach for a swim. The weather conditions were pretty rough, so only one other person actually went into the water with him. Harold ended up going too far out and got caught in the rip, which pulled him completely out of sight. This was actually the last time anybody has ever seen him because his body has never been found. His last words were, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." It's super sad to know that he really had no idea the danger that he was just about to put himself in. In our number 1 spot today, we have Samuel Doe. Samuel was the 21st president of Liberia from 1986 until 1990. Samuel was a master sergeant who actually led a military coup in April of 1980, which killed the then president, William R. Tolbert Jr. He ended up being quite a corrupt and totalitarian president and only got more and more repressive as time went on. In 1989, a civil war started in Liberia when rebels entered. In September of 1990, Samuel was captured by the rebels as well as a former ally of his, Charles Taylor. In order to prove that Samuel was not protected by black magic, they started by cutting his ears off first. There are some pretty gruesome details that happen after, as he was tortured for 12 hours, which was recorded before they eventually killed him. The last words that Samuel spoke were those that one of his captors told him to say, were that the government is overthrown. I am therefore asking the armed forces to surrender to Field Marshal Prince Johnson. Prince Johnson being the one behind this coup. I honestly just can't think of a worse way to go. So this story really freaks me out. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Michael Ney. Michael Ney was a first duke, and he was the first prince of the Moskva, and was a French military commander in the French Revolutionary Wars, as well as the Napoleonic Wars. He was even one of the original 18 marshals of the empire that Napoleon I created. After Napoleon was dethroned and exiled in 1815, however, Michael was arrested and tried by the Chamber of Peers for treason. When the verdict was given, 137 peers voted for the death penalty, 17 voted for deportation, 5 abstained, and there was 1 single vote for acquittal. Unfortunately, this was a majority rules situation, and Michael was sentenced to death by the firing squad. On December 7th, 1815, Michael was put in front of a firing squad, and he refused to wear a blindfold. He was surprisingly given the right to order the fire himself, and before doing so, these are the final words that he spoke. "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order. It will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France, and not one against her. Soldiers, fire." I couldn't imagine having to be the one to order your own death, especially when you don't want to die, so this one definitely leaves quite an eerie feeling. In our number 9 spot today, we have Pompey the Great. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. Pompey the Great is the oldest person on this list, as he was born in 106 BC and passed away in 48 BC at the age of 57. Pompey was a Roman general, and his career played a significant role in the evolution from a republic to an empire. At one point, he was an ally of Julius Caesar, but they became enemies, and this is what led to Pompey's death. In 48 BC, there was a civil war in which Caesar beat Pompey's army, and Pompey began to retreat to Egypt. Once he got there, he hoped that King Ptolemy would help him, but unfortunately the king feared Caesar, so instead the king invited him ashore at Pelusium, and it was there that Pompey was assassinated. Pompey's final words were to one of the assassins, and it seems as though Pompey recognized him. He said, "I am not mistaken, surely, in believing you to have been formerly my fellow soldier. Certainly being assassinated is never good, but by people you know and possibly trusted is definitely quite a dark twist." In our number 8 spot today, we have Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born in November of 1554 and was an English poet and soldier, and is one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan era. In 1586, he joined Sir John Norris in the Battle of Zutphen. Sorry if I said that wrong, in the fight against the Spanish, but it was during this battle that he was shot in the thigh, which would ultimately lead to his death. One of the most well-known stories about Sir Philip Sidney is when he was laying wounded next to another soldier who was also wounded. He spoke his last words to the other soldier when he was giving him his water. He said, "Take it. Thy need is greater than mine." It seems as though he must have known he was about to pass, but it also shows the kind of person he was, which seems to be a very noble person. He certainly left a legacy, considering we are still here talking about him today. In our number 7 spot today, we have Joachim Murat. Joachim Murat was a marshal of the empire and an admiral to Napoleon, and he was also the king of Naples from 1808 to 1815. A lot of people attribute his titles to the fact that he actually married Napoleon's younger sister, Caroline Bonaparte, but he is also remembered as brave and charismatic. He was also known as a fancy dresser, so he gained the nickname the Dandy King, which I love. After the fall of Napoleon, he was captured by the forces of King Ferdinand IV of Naples, and was eventually tried and sentenced to death by firing squad. When the time came, he refused a chair and a blindfold and said, "I have braved death too often to fear it." He then stood up tall and proudly and kissed a carving of the face of his wife that he had with him, and then he spoke his final words, which were, "Soldiers, do your duty, straight to the heart but spare the face. fire. Honestly, I don't know how these people stay so calm and collected during these undoubtedly terrifying moments. In our number 6 spot today, we have Major Lloyd Williams. Major Lloyd Williams was born in 1887 and was an officer in the United States Marine Corps and passed away fighting in World War I. On June 11th of 1918, he was leading an assault and had been sent to help the French army in the Battle of Belleau Wood, which barely left anyone on their side alive. When they first arrived, they found the French retreating already, but Lloyd did not want to. When a French major told Lloyd to retreat, he told him to go to hell, which I guess I can appreciate. Later in the battle, Lloyd found himself gassed and injured by shrapnel and was down on the battlefield, severely injured. When medics approached him, he spoke his last words, which were, "Don't bother with me, take care of my good men." I obviously have no knowledge of what would have happened if they did choose to retreat when the French major suggested it, but I definitely think it is honorable that he ensured his men were tended to first. In our number 5 spot today, we have Murray Hudson. Murray Hudson was born in 1938 and was a sergeant with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. On February 13th, 1974, Murray was a drill instructor and was supervising a training exercise when things really took a turn for the worst. One of the officers in training, or a non-commissioned officer who was participating in this training exercise, accidentally armed a grenade that he was about to throw. This is obviously an incredibly frightening situation and one that made the officer completely freeze. After all, what really do you do in that situation? Murray saw him freeze and realized what had happened and ordered him to throw it, which I guess is the smartest move and the thing that you would do in this situation. The officer unfortunately was still frozen and wasn't reacting, so in an attempt to save him, Murray went over and took his hand and tried to release the grenade so that he could throw it. During this process, the grenade unfortunately exploded, which took both of their lives. The final words of Murray were his directions and him saying, "Throw it, just throw it." Such a tragic event that absolutely could have been avoided. Murray was awarded the George Cross after his passing, which is the highest award bestowed by the British government for gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. In our number 4 spot today, we have Louis Joseph de Montcalm. Louis Joseph was a French soldier who was born in 1712 and was commander of the forces in North America during the 7 Years' War. In September of 1759, he decided to attack the British with the forces he had instead of waiting for more people and more numbers. Many people believed that this was his greatest mistake, but he felt like if he waited, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the British. That may be true, but without waiting, the British of course still defeated the French forces. Louis was riding back to the city when he was struck by a musket shot in the back. There were 3 soldiers who helped him back to the city and to a surgeon who explained that he wouldn't be able to even make it through the night. Before his commanding officers left him for the last time, he had some not so nice words for them. His final words happened to be, "I have much business that must be attended to of greater moment than your ruined garrison and this wretched country." Considering he's talking about the country that I live in, that seems a little rude, but I can understand why he felt that way. In our number 3 spot today, we have Simon Bolivar. Simon, who is often referred to as the Liberator, was born in 1783 and was a military and political leader that led Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama to their independence from the Spanish Empire. He was 47 years old in 1830 and had resigned from his presidency and was planning on heading to Europe. He even had already sent crates of his belongings, but unfortunately fell extremely ill before he was able to leave his country. On December 17th of 1830, he was about to lose his battle with tuberculosis and was extremely delirious, so his last words are actually very strange. There are some accounts that his last words were, "Damn it, how will I ever get out of this labyrinth?" And other accounts say that his final words were, "Fetch the luggage, they do not want us here." Truthfully, either way, it is clear that he wasn't necessarily in his right mind, but it's also very clear that he was looking for some way out or some sort of escape. In our number 2 spot today, we have John Sedgwick. John Sedgwick was born in 1813 and was a military officer and Union Army general during the American Civil War. On May 9, 1864, he and his men were at the Spotsylvania courthouse and he was directing different placements when Confederate sharpshooters, who were around 1,000 yards away, began shooting at them. This of course caused for some of John's men to duck for cover like any regular human being would when being shot at. I'm not exactly sure why, but John seemed to have been less concerned with the shots and more concerned with the soldiers taking cover, and he continued to strut around and say, "I'm ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." It was unfortunately just a few moments later that he was fatally struck by a bullet just under his left eye. His chief of staff, Martin T. McMahon, was close to him and heard his last words and tried to catch him as he fell. Medical personnel were of course called as quickly as possible, but unfortunately he never regained consciousness. In our number 1 spot today we have Alexander Prokhorenko. In 2016, Alexander was a senior lieutenant with the Special Armed Forces of the Russian Armed Forces. He was 25 years old at the time and was fighting in the Syrian Civil War. On March 17th of 2016, during the Palmyra offensive, he found himself surrounded by ISIS militants. Not wanting to be captured alive and also bravely doing what he thought was best, he ordered an airstrike on his location. His command was slightly confused in the beginning of this order and asked him to confirm his order, and this is when Alexander spoke his final words to command. He said, "They are outside. This is the end, Commander. Thank you. Tell my family and my country I love them. Tell them I was brave and I fought until I could no longer. Please take care of my family. Avenge my death. Goodbye, Commander. Tell my family I love them." Alexander left behind his wife Katya and the child they were expecting at the time of his death. He was nicknamed the Russian Rambo after his death and was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation for his ultimate sacrifice.
Coming in at number 10, we have The Ring. A paramedic on Reddit said that they were riding in the back of an ambulance with someone who had just been in a serious car accident. They were losing a lot of blood but still conscious, and it seemed that they were going to make it to the hospital. The last thing that the person said to them was, "Take the ring out of my pocket." It wasn't long after that that this person flatlined before they were even able to make it back to the ER. The paramedic didn't go fishing through their pockets to find this ring because, for one, that is illegal and it morally feels very strange. But they never got to find out why this person wanted them to take this ring off of them. There was the chance that they had some sort of head injury from the crash and that they couldn't clearly comprehend where they were. Or maybe it was some sort of family heirloom and this person knew that they didn't have anyone to pass it on to. Maybe they didn't want something so precious to be buried in the ground with them, and they thought it should have been passed on to the person who was trying to save their life. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Coming at number 9, we have There's Nothing There. Reddit user GunMedic15 said that they had just picked up someone who was going into cardiac arrest. They got them into the back of the ambulance while they were still conscious, and they hooked them up to the EKG monitor so he could check out what was going on with his heartbeat. He saw that he was going into a lethal rhythm, and that sounds like the title of an R&B album from the 90s, but it basically means your heart can't pump blood properly and you're starting to drift off, and if you don't fix it, you're going to die. Well, this man had enough blood circulating in him to say one last thing before he went. The only thing he said was, "But I don't see a light," and then he was gone. The paramedic tried to bring him back, but he was unable to save his life. We like to think we know what's on the other side, but we really have no clue what happens to us when we die. Coming in at number 8, we have Are You in Any Pain? You have to ask these questions as a paramedic. Now, if you're on the other end of this and you clearly are in a lot of pain, this could seem like a dumb question, but it's just the other party doing their job. That being said, if you're about to die, say whatever you want because nothing matters and we are alone in the universe. So a paramedic talked about when they were tending to someone who had just been stabbed. When he first got there, he said, "Are you in any pain?" And the man said, "Yes, I'm in pain. What the hell do you think? I was just stabbed." The man didn't live very much longer, but at least he went out without holding anything back. I think some of us would rather fake not dying so we don't inconvenience the paramedic with trying to save our life. Coming in number 7, we have the overdose. A paramedic shows up at the scene after someone calls about an overdose. They rushed in to help the person. They were still semi-conscious. They had just taken too much of an opioid and they were drifting off pretty quickly. This person was clearly an addict for quite some time. You could tell by their body that they were wasting away, which was going to make it so much harder to save their life. As the paramedics were putting this person onto the gurney, they said, "I'm scared," then they drifted off. They did everything they could to try and keep this person alive, but there was no luck. It must have been heart-wrenching to have someone in that moment who's looking to you for help and is so frightened. They would just want your help, and it would be so hard to tell them what's going on without making them more afraid. Coming in number 6, we have what's worth your time. An elderly man was being transported to the hospital by 2 paramedics in the back of an ambulance. He was starting to slip away. He was going into cardiac arrest. He turned to one of the paramedics and he said, "I spent too much time vacuuming," and then he drifted off and died. I think that's something that would probably be ringing in all of our minds when we're about to go. What did we really spend our life on? I hope that when I'm going, I don't have negative feelings about how I spent my life. As of right now, I think I'm doing a pretty good job. Coming in number 5, we have stay positive. A man in his early 30s was in a terrible car accident. The way that it was described in the Reddit thread was that he didn't have much of a chance surviving even if he was in the emergency room when it happened. They didn't go into detail about what that means, but I'm sure you can tell that it's not good. The man was still conscious as he was being rushed to the ER, so he took his time to ask the paramedic about what was going on with his body. He wanted to know the extent of his injuries. The paramedic gave him a full breakdown, the best he could in this stressful moment, and the man who was about to die said, "At least it's not raining." If you're about to go and you can feel your life slipping away, I guess you could be scared, or you could be happy and just hope that whatever is waiting for you on the other side will be something that's even nicer than what you got to experience on this side. I hope that more people feel that kind of security as they're passing on to the other side, no matter what the situation is. Coming in at number 4, we have skydiving. Some people who seem healthy can have some pretty serious medical issues. Reddit user Reddit Owns My Life talked about the last words they heard from a guy who seemed pretty healthy on the surface, but this man had an unstable heart arrhythmia. Basically, when his heart was beating, it wasn't doing a good enough job, so he wasn't getting enough oxygen passed around through his body. This would cause him to pass out, and most people don't survive with this for very long. This man with the heart problem in this story described the feeling of going in and out of consciousness as the same feeling you get when you jump out of a plane when you're skydiving. The paramedic said the guy passed out right in front of him, and before he did, he said, "Are you going to take me skydiving again?" And that was the last thing that this man ever said. Coming in at number 3, we have not ready. The whole concept of death is so terrifying because we have no idea what happens. That's why we come up with so many things like religion, astrology, or simulation theory. All of these things are supposed to give us the answer to the unknown. Religion tells us what happens after you die and how you're supposed to live your life. Astrology tells you who you are and why other people are the way that they are, and simulation theory tries to tell us how the universe and reality was created. But really, we don't have the answer to any of these questions, and no matter where you put your faith, when your final moments come, you will most likely feel an overwhelming feeling of insecurity. That is what happened in this experience when this paramedic arrived on the scene after an old woman had had a heart attack. She was still conscious, but she could feel herself fading. She kept saying over and over, "I don't want to die." The paramedic said he could still hear her voice in his head. She didn't make it much longer in the ambulance before she passed away. Coming in number 2, we have a dying secret. In your last moments, if you have anything you want to get off your chest, you better do it right then and there, because there is literally no other time you can do it. Just make sure that you are for sure going to die, because you don't want to let all your dirty secrets out and then find out you're going to live. Ooh, that would be embarrassing. Well, this paramedic heard someone's last words that were both incriminating and mysterious. They had loaded someone into the back of the ambulance after they were shot. They were hit a few times, so it didn't look like they were going to make it. This guy had enough energy to ask the paramedic if he thought he was going to live, and he finished the sentence with, "Please be honest with me." The paramedic told him the truth, that there was a good chance he wouldn't. So this man, with his final words, said, "I committed many crimes throughout the 80s. Then he went into a little bit of detail, and he also said, "No one ever caught me." Then he drifted off and died. Now, when you hear something like that, you have no idea if it's the truth. Did this guy just say that to freak out the paramedic as one final sick joke? Or did he get what he needed off his chest, but he didn't give enough information to finish solving the puzzle? And coming at the number 1 spot, we have F.U. Many of you watching know all about Tupac. He was one of the most influential musicians of his time and is still respected as one of the best rappers to this day. I wonder what his opinion of the rap game would be when he saw all of these people with their colored dreads talking about taking too much Xanax and rapping about Heelys. Remember when black people made the blues and then eventually white people turned it into glam rock? I think that's what's happening to the rap game right now. But back to talking about Tupac, he has some of the most famous last words in history. Tupac was shot on the Vegas Strip, and in his last moments, an officer and a paramedic were trying to help him. The officer asked him who shot him, and Tupac responded with F.U. I think you can imagine that he didn't say F.U. He was one of the hardest people of his time, and he was about to die. I don't think he was really going to censor himself in his final moments. But even though that would have been amazing to find out who shot the rapper, it's nice to go out out like a badass. Coming in at number 10, we have Lars Matank, a very strange story from a man that was just a young dude trying to have some fun. Lars Matank went down to Bulgaria with 4 friends and all of them were having a great time. They were getting drunk and watching soccer, but here's the thing with soccer. It can be a very sensitive subject for some people. So there were some guys at this bar that didn't agree with Lars and his friends' opinion on soccer. This caused a massive brawl in the bar and everyone was pretty fine except for Lars. He had a ruptured eardrum from getting hit and this would roll into more problems. Him and his friends were supposed to fly the next day, but Lars couldn't because of his ear. So his friends had to take off without him. Lars was stuck trying to find another way home, but he started to become extremely paranoid. He thought that men were after him. The last words that anyone heard him say was his mother. He called her and told her that someone was after him. There was footage of him running out of his hotel, but no one knows what happened to the poor young man. Coming at number 9, we have missing in Costa Rica. Back in 2018, a girl named Carla would be in Costa Rica. She sent a message to her family saying things were pretty sketchy here, and those would be the last words that anyone ever heard from her. Carla was down in Costa Rica with her sister-in-law and things seemed to be going great. The two of them were having tons of fun, but they didn't get flights returning at the same time. Carla's sister-in-law came back early and Carla was left at her Airbnb alone. That was when she sent this message. The power kept cutting in and out at her Airbnb and she thought something could go wrong soon. The weird thing is, this isn't the last time someone saw Carla. She reportedly went to the airport and even checked in but never got on her flight. Someone said they saw her get into a strange car at the airport and police think that she might have been abducted. Next on the list we have yes. Not a lot of information to go off of when someone just sends you the word yes and then disappears forever. This story goes back to 2017 and it's about Jaden Pino Thompson. He was traveling across the United States with his friend. The two were a couple of young dudes that were out there trying to have a good time, but partway through the trip Jaden's mother got worried. She hadn't talked to him for a while and she knew that he was not doing well emotionally. He was having a lot of problems with his father. So his mother tried to contact him but she couldn't get a hold of him. For an entire day she called and texted and he never responded. She kept asking if he was okay and where he was, and he later responded with one word, which was yes. It's so annoying when you send someone a novel worth of text and then they give you a one-word answer. Well, Jaden was later reported missing. Apparently him and his friend Lucas, who he was traveling with, got into an argument and Lucas left him on the side of the road. After this, no one has ever seen him. Some people think that Jaden might have been going through some type of paranoia. This is because he was telling people that there was a warrant for his arrest, but there was no such thing. Coming in at number 7, we have lost on a hike. Whenever you're going on a hike, you should always bring some friends and a way to contact people. This is a must for me because I have a terrible sense of direction. Well, Robert Goldmeiser would fall victim to his bad sense of direction. In 2016, he went for a hike in New Zealand with a friend, but right at the beginning of the hike, his buddy backed out. Sometimes you look at the mountain and you see how high it is and you realize it's way too much to deal with. Well, Robert went on by himself, and while he was doing this, he was texting his partner. Partway through the hike, he said he was scared, and his partner was texting him back asking him if he was okay. All of a sudden, Robert stopped responding. This is when things got scary. Robert's partner kept trying to contact him, but after a day of silence, he called the police and a search was launched to try and find Robert. The party looked for Robert for an entire day, and right when it looked like there was no hope, he was found. What happened is when he was on the way back on his hike, he got lost and ended up walking in circles through the woods. He had to spend 2 nights in the freezing cold before he was ever found. He would be taken to the hospital and survive this traumatic experience. Number 6 on the list, we have Frederick Valentich. Now for something a little bit more spooky. It's time for an alien abduction story. This has to be one of the most famous abduction stories of all time. Freddie Val was working for the Australian military. He was one of the best pilots. He was known for hitting sick barrel rolls and showing off to all the ladies. I may have made that part up, but this next part is the truth. In 1978, Freddie was in charge of a test flight that should have gone off without a hitch, but part way through the flight, he reported something that was following him. He said that there was something that looked like a flying saucer floating next to his ship. He tried to avoid the strange spacecraft, but no matter where he turned, the thing would keep pace with him and tracked him down. He reported back to base via radio that he had no idea what this thing was, and he eventually said it's hovering and it's not an aircraft. At this point, I assumed that the dude was pooping his little pants, but we will never know because right after he said this, the radio went dead and Freddie Boy disappeared. He was never heard from again, and the people who are really into alien conspiracy theories will tell you that the Australian government has more info on what happened that day, but they refuse to share it with the public. At number 5 on the list, we have Timothy Piston. This was a wild missing person case from back in 2011. Timothy Piston and the rest of his family all traveled from Illinois to Wisconsin. They were all set to spend the weekend at a water park and have a great time. It should have been a great weekend of memories, but it turned out to be a horror show for the entire family. Not long after checking into the hotel, Timothy would go missing and never be seen again. Apparently, one of the last things he said to his mom was asking her for a glass of water. This is something that was all over the news and a massive heartbreak for the entire family. There are so many twists and turns to this case, we could do an entire list just on this case. Coming in at number 4, we have Brandon Lawson. Back in 2013, Brandon Lawson would take off in his truck after getting into a fight with his girlfriend, and that is the only part of the story that sounds normal. Not long after driving away, he had to pull over because he was out of gas, and then he called his brother. He told his brother that he had been chased out of town and people were coming to kill him. This was very strange, and Brandon had a history of drug use, so he might have been having a trip. Well, Brandon then called the police and told him he was being chased through the woods, and then he called his girlfriend and told her he was in the woods bleeding, and then he was never seen again. Coming in at number 3, we have Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson is the man responsible for colonizing the Hudson Bay. He was obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage. If he had found the Northwest Passage, this would have opened trade between Europe and Asia, and he would have been the famed explorer who made it happen. Well, to do this kind of thing, you have to bring a bunch of men with you, and all of them have their own opinions. And to find the Northwest Passage, you have to move through one of the coldest areas on the planet. And they were also trying to do this in 1610. So when it got cold back then, you didn't have heated seats to keep you warm. Well, Henry tried to get his men to push on from Hudson's Bay and find the Northwest Passage, but it turns out that the dudes on board didn't like this plan. They mutinied and took him and the 8 men who wanted to stay with him and put them in a boat in the middle of the Hudson's Bay. They then left them in that boat in the middle of the bay and took off. Apparently Hudson wished them all death before he was never seen again. Obviously this dude is dead now, but no one knows what happened to him after he was left out in the bay. Coming in at number 2, we have Cherry Mahan. Cherry went missing in 1985, and since then no one has ever seen her. The last person to ever see her alive was a school bus driver who dropped her off. He said "have a nice day" to her, and she responded "I'll see you later." Her drop off was only 50 feet from her home. For some reason she didn't make it all the way back to her front door. It's suspected that she was kidnapped by someone, but no one knows who could have done this. The case has been open to this day, and in the 30 plus years that people have been searching for this girl, the only lead was a blue van that someone saw parked on the street. There was no license plate and no other information on the van, and it has never been tracked down. To this day, no one knows what happened to Cherry. And last on the list, we have Ray Gricker. This man was the district attorney that was going after Jerry Sandusky, but at the time of his disappearance, no one knew this. Ray Gricker was the district attorney of Century County, Pennsylvania, and out of nowhere, one day he disappeared. The last thing anyone heard from him was his girlfriend getting a call from Gricker telling her that he was coming home from work soon. He never showed up, and his car was found with everything taken out of it. The last things that were found in his car was a laptop and phone. Both of these items had been soaked in water, so it was too hard to get any sort of information out of them. It wasn't until after this that it became public knowledge that Gricker had been working on a case to take down Penn State football coach Jerry Sandusky. People think that the university and Sandusky might have gotten word that Gricker was building a case against them and wanted to take him out before things went public. You'd be surprised how much money and power a school like Penn State has.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Russian girl. This message was written by a Russian girl named Vala Barin. Her and her husband were caught and jailed by the secret police of Nazi Germany. The final messages that she left on her cell wall were heartbreaking. This is what she wrote, and I quote, "Here was held in custody Vala Barin, who was betrayed by her own Russian compatriots. My husband and I were both put away in one cell. Another 3 Russian civilians and 1 prisoner of war were in the same cell. They had pistols. We will be facing the gallows. My only regret is to be separated from the beloved husband and the whole wide world." This message really displays the horrors of that time. An innocent woman and her husband locked away, just waiting for their turn to be hung. It really is quite terrifying. In our 9th spot today, we have the Watchful Eye. This next piece of graffiti was found in the abandoned West Virginia penitentiary. It says, "I'm watching you, Freddie-O." Now, I don't know who Freddie-O is, and I don't really want to know, but I feel bad for them. That is absolutely terrifying. Someone was keeping a watchful eye on him. The eye itself Also, just looks horrifying, like it's staring right into my soul. Ooh. Moving on to number 8, we have Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez was an American football player in the NFL for 3 seasons. However, in 2013, he was arrested for the death of his friend, Odin Lloyd. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But in 2017, Aaron took his life in jail. Before doing so, he apparently cut his finger and wrote John 3:16 on the wall in his own blood. He also wrote it on his forehead as well. John 3:16 said that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall never die, but have eternal life. Not only that, but another report said that he drew an unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye on the wall as well, which is hella creepy. Like, why did he do that? What is this supposed to mean? I'm creeped out. In our 7th spot today, we have Welcome Home. This next message was captured by photographer Mark Perot. He got a tour of Eastern State Penitentiary, and he was just going there to capture the empty building and the abandoned rooms. But while there, he found a deeper connection to the graffiti on the prison cell walls. So he started to photograph that instead. In one cell, a prisoner left a very creepy, welcoming message. It says, "Welcome home, convict." Now, we're not sure if the person who wrote the message was freed or ended up dying in jail, but we do know that that was one of his final messages. And it was to the person who would be taking over his room. But it's not really a warm welcoming if you ask me. Coming in at number 6, we have the hanging tree. This next message left by a prisoner is fairly dark. Basically, the prisoner drew himself being hung from a tree. The words, "This is my family tree," are written by it with arrows. Clearly, this message has a deeper meaning. One can interpret that he meant his family tree, or family bloodline, ends after his death. We can assume he never had kids, so after his death, that's the end of their family name. I guess he has no other siblings or living relatives, which is dark as hell. This prisoner was later found in his room dead. He hung himself with his bedsheet. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the gallows. In 2014, a jail in Windsor was allowing visitors to come in and go on guided tours. This, of course, was after the prison was decommissioned and the inmates were moved to another prison. Now, this prison is eerie for a number of reasons. Number 1, the jail had a built-in gallows, which they used up until the death penalty was removed in 1976. But before that, they were hanging prisoners right there in the very prison. To this day, the trap door as well as the bolts where the ropes used to hang are still visible. Not only that, but the cells are filled with scary graffiti. The government has since tried to get this graffiti removed, but this is pretty creepy. This was the last message written by an inmate before he got moved to the new facility. It says, "We are moving southwest, so don't hang around." The end. Obviously, hang was a play on words. Just knowing the history of that prison makes that message that much more darker. In our 4th spot today, we have the hit list. For this one, let's take a trip to Bogo Road Jail in Australia. So this jail had a strict set of rules. Prisoners were not allowed to write on or deface their cell walls. Any graffiti that was spotted was quickly removed. But in 1989, they started to let this slide since the jail was facing closure. This was one of the eerie messages they found in one of the cells. This is the list of prison officers that worked at this jail. It was written as a threat to scare the officers that the inmates didn't like. It was also meant to scare any new officers coming in. Kind of like, "You're next." I don't know about you, but if I walked in and saw my name on that list and knew that they were coming after me, I'd walk right back out. Moving on at number 3, we have the dead man's gun. This eerie message was left by a prisoner who was on death row. It was hard to find a lot of information on him, but basically he was put on death row after being convicted of killing a man after they found his fingerprints on the murder weapon. But according to the prisoner, he was never able to tell his full side of the story. He never confessed and always maintained that he was innocent. He did witness the murder of his friend and made the mistake of picking up the murder weapon, but he had nothing to do with the actual murder. That's what he was trying to get at with this final message. Moving on at number 2, we have the bloodbath. This next creepy message was left in the showers of a now abandoned prison. Clearly, someone didn't like what another prisoner was doing and left this message as a warning. It says, "This is what will happen next time. Bloodbath." Isn't that just great? I hope no one ever crossed this prisoner again. I would hate to see the outcome of that. And in the number 1 spot today, we have the Craigslist Killer. Philip Markoff, better known as the Craigslist Killer, is responsible for taking the life of Jalissa Brisman on April 14th, 2009. Markoff got his name because he would go on Craigslist and respond to sexual ads, meet up with them before attacking and robbing them. He received immense gratification from doing so, but in the end, he was caught. His final words were directed to his fiancée, Megan, who he had given the nickname Pocket to. On August 15th, 2010, Markoff took his own life in his cell. As he was bleeding out, he left one final message in blood. He wrote Megan's name along with Pocket on the wall. The words he wrote itself aren't scary, but it's the fact that he wrote this when he was bleeding out and dying. In fact, Markoff made sure he wasn't going to come back from this. Officers found toilet paper shoved down his throat so that they couldn't resuscitate him.
Alright, coming in at number 10, we have space snakes. Dr. Musgrave is a trustworthy man, or at least his credentials suggest he must be. Not only is he a NASA astronaut, he has 6 degrees, and he's a doctor and a mathematician. He has made 6 space flights, and he believes that there is life out there. In 1994, he said, "On 2 of my missions, and I still don't have an answer, I have seen a snake out there." What? It's not just a wee little space snake either. He said that it was 6, 7 or 8 feet long. He said that the snake followed him around for a long period of time and he tried to communicate with it. Space snakes, honestly. Dr. Musgrave thinks that they must have their own propulsion technique, which honestly is just baffling and is a can of worms or snakes. Coming in at number 9, we have asteroids. Astronaut Chris Hadfield conducted a Reddit AMA and he discussed something that scared him. He said, "Sometimes we hear pings as tiny rocks hit our spaceship, and also the creaks and snaps of expanding metal as we go in and out of sunlight. The solar panels are filled with tiny holes from micrometeorites." Honestly, that really terrifies me as a person who's like a bit scared of flying in an aeroplane. This would deeply stress me out. He also said, "I watched a large meteorite burn up between me and Australia, and to think of that hypersonic dumb lump of rock randomly hurtling into us instead sent a shiver up my back." Like, I'll say Chris, mate, Jesus. Coming into number 8, we have The Formation. Gordon Cooper, the last American to spend time in space alone, has had a couple of very strange experiences in the skies. The first happened when he was a member of the Air Force. He was flying with other pilots in 1951 when he saw, I quote, "a vast armada of UFOs flying in formation at extremely high altitudes." I'm sorry, but vast armada, that is terrifying, not just one curious UFO, a whole fleet. On top of that, in 1963, Cooper was shot into space aboard a Mercury capsule to circumnavigate the world. As he was passing Perth, he noticed a fast-flying green object that was also picked up by Australian tracking systems. Now, the press were briefed that they were not allowed to talk to him about this. Why? Like, seriously, why? Coming into number 7, we have the check mark. American astronaut Leroy Chiao was the commander of the International Space Station in 2005. During his time up there, he saw some extremely weird things. He explained his encounter to the Huffington Post by saying, "I saw some lights that seemed to be in a line and it was almost like an upside down check mark, and I saw them fly by and I thought it was awfully strange." Could this have been the formation that Cooper was talking about? Some skeptics even tried to pass the lights off as far off fishing boat lights from Earth, but to be honest, I'm skeptical of those skeptics. Coming in at number 6, we have Magnificent Desolation. What is it like on the moon? Utterly terrifying according to Buzz Aldrin. Buzz, as we know, was the second man on the moon. Yes, televised recordings of the moon can be seen, and yes, we have high-res photographs, but truly knowing what it feels like to be up there is something only a handful of people can talk to us about. In a Reddit AMA, Buzz Aldrin describes his experience. He said, "My first words of my impression of being on the surface of the moon that just came to my mind find are magnificent desolation. He continued by saying, "There is no place on Earth as desolate as what I was viewing in those first few moments on the lunar surface. Beyond me, I could see the moon curving away, no atmosphere, black sky, cold, colder than anyone could experience on Earth when the sun is up." While that sounds totally incredible, it also sounds like the beginnings of a total existential breakdown. Coming into number 5, we have the spheres. In 1981, following the Saljut mission, the USSR cosmonaut Major General Vladimir Kolyvanov gave a press conference in which he shared some very interesting information. He said that he looked out of a porthole and saw something he simply couldn't explain, something impossible to the laws of physics. He described the object he saw as spherical and elliptical, saying that it exploded into a beautiful golden light. After that, he saw 2 more spheres and a white smoke sphere cloud. Then, as they flew through the Terminator, the name for the zone between light and day, he lost sight of them. Honestly, how fascinating and terrifying at the very same time. To me, it's also weird and interesting how Russia appears to be more forthcoming in discussing things that they've seen in space, whereas the United States are keen to keep a lid on it. Why do you think the United States are so heavily guarded on what they'll say about what they've seen in space? Honestly, I don't know. Coming into number 4, we have the knocking. In 2003, Yang Liwei was the first Chinese astronaut to be propelled into space. Now, I understand the loneliness of space might send you a little bit mad, but he said one night that he heard a strange and continuous knocking. He said, and I quote, "Someone was knocking on the body of the spaceship, just as knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. It neither came from outside nor inside the spaceship." I'm sorry, but honestly, what? Isn't that some of the creepiest space descriptions that you've ever heard? It seems he wasn't the last to hear it either. 2 further astronauts heard the same space knocks when they went up there. What are these? Coming into number 3, we have the music. Listening to the transcript of the words said on board Apollo 10 is bone chilling. The spaceship passed by the dark side of the moon, and as it did, the astronauts heard a very weird ethereal music. This is what was said between Eugene Cernan, Thomas Stafford, and John Young. "That music sounds out of spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that whistling sound? Yes. Boy, that sure is weird music. We're gonna have to find out about that. Nobody will believe us." Later, Cernan said, "That eerie music is what's bothering me. You know what? I hear it too. Who is going to believe it? Nobody. Should we tell them about it? I don't know, I think we ought to think about it some." It seems that the Apollo 11 crew heard it too. What was it? We don't really know. Coming into number 2, we have heat is rising in the capsule. So this is really sad and really disturbing, so do skip forward if you aren't ready for something truly terrifying. In 1967, Russian cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov did not make it back to Earth alive, something he suspected would happen when he agreed to be the solo pilot of the Soyuz 1. His spacecraft malfunctioned and he was quite aware he was going to die. Some of the last things he said can't be translated into words. He was screaming and crying words of anger. Among the last words that can be deciphered are, "The heat is rising in the capsule," and "You've killed me." Honestly, that makes me so sad. Finally, coming into number 1, we have "They're watching us." Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, had something very scary to say when he arrived at the moon in the Apollo 11 mission. It was something he spoke about once but never spoke about again. In a secret transmission to NASA, according to the retired chief of communications system Maurice Chatelain, the first man on the moon's first words were actually, "Oh God, you won't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out here lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." Now, this wasn't heard by the world as the broadcast was dropped for 2 minutes. Armstrong never spoke about it again, although a lot of credible sources have confirmed that this is what he said.
So starting us off like we always do at number 10 with toxic diet pills. "I think I'm going to die." Elos Perry had a history of bulimia and she had been taking diet pills that are supposed to help you lose weight. She unfortunately binged on the pills after she bought them online in a desperate attempt to lose weight fast. Well, the pills that she took contained a highly toxic substance known as NDP, and it doesn't have an antidote. She texted her college professor and classmates that she thought she was going to die. Well, medics tried to save her, but she died 4 hours after her text message was sent. A suicide comes in at number 9. At 22 years old, a woman killed herself after she had an argument with her boyfriend. Jasmine Mitchell was a veterinary nursing student who had attempted to commit suicide twice before. She sent her boyfriend this chilling text message, "Third time a lucky," before she fatally hung herself in May of 2015. After she was discovered, her family paid tribute to her on their Facebook page, trying to raise awareness for suicide prevention. Up next, number 8, we have a plane crash. "I'm in a plane out of control and it's going down." A father sent this tragic text message before he was killed in a fatal plane crash. Investigators found no faults with the plane, and they said that the weather conditions were unlikely to have caused the crash. Apparently he had received multiple death threats in the weeks leading up to this incident, and this text message was sent several minutes before the plane had even begun to spin or descend. So this incident is very suspicious. Buried alive comes in at number 7. "Mummy, I got buried. Please make it quick." Louisiane Amatello sent a series of desperate text messages to her family when she found herself trapped beneath the rubble of a building. This was one of New Zealand's deadliest disasters when a 6.3 magnitude earthquake killed at least 113 people and left 228 missing. This poor girl was able to make one last phone call to her parents who lived in the Philippines, and her mother said that her voice was shaking and she was really scared. She knew her daughter was in a lot of pain, but she kept trying to reassure and comfort her. Number 6 brings us to a scary kidnapping. OMG, I think I'm being kidnapped. April Millsap was only 14 years old when she discovered she was in a drainage ditch in Michigan near a walking trail. This was the final text message she sent before she went missing. She was walking with her dog when she was brutally attacked and murdered. Her dog actually led 2 people who were out for a long jog to her body. Police had no leads or suspects in this murder case, and it is likely that her murderer will get away with this horrific murder. Her boyfriend thought that she was just kidding when she sent the text message. So guys, it is very important, if you feel that you are in danger, don't text someone. Call 911 immediately. Make sure there is help coming for you, and then text away if you must. Worst girlfriend comes in at number 5. Mitchell Carter was 17 years old when she pressured and urged her boyfriend to kill himself by sending him dozens of awful text messages. Some of the final text messages she sent to him were, "Are you okay? You can do this. Everyone will be sad for a while, but they will get over it and move on. And you just need to do it, Conrad." I mean, is this real life right now? That is just so messed up. Oh, and the text messages continued. She also said, "No more pushing it off." After this final text message on July the 12th, 2014, he killed himself in his truck via carbon dioxide poisoning. She was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 15 months in jail. She even sent him ways to kill himself. She wrote, "Hang yourself, jump off a building, stab yourself." I don't know, there are ways. I just can't believe that someone would even send this to anyone, let alone to her boyfriend, someone that she loved. Tragic tornado storms its way into number 4. Goodbye Mama, it's heading right for me. These were the 2 final messages sent by Jeffrey Hunter to his mother back in April 2015. A tornado was rapidly moving towards his home in Arkansas, and he knew he only had a few minutes to say his last goodbyes. His mother tried to keep him calm, even though she knew how bad the tornado was. She said that she will cherish these messages and his memory forever. That is just so damn sad. Number 3 brings us to a scary shooting. I needed to do this though, I wasn't happy, and I need my crew with me too. I'm sorry, I love you. This was back in October of 2014. 15-year-old Jalen Freiberg sent a series of text messages. First, he told his family how he wanted to be buried, and then he sent a message apologizing to the families whose children he was about to kill. He gunned down 4 of his friends before turning the gun on himself. Pulse nightclub shooting comes in at number 2. He's coming, I'm gonna die. This was a heartbreaking text message that was sent from Eddie Justice. He was a victim from the Pulse nightclub shooting that occurred in Orlando, and it was one of the worst mass shootings in US history. Eddie's mother begged him to keep texting her, and she said, "I love you," but Eddie never responded. 50 people died that night, including the shooter, and 58 other people suffered from a non-fatal injury. Finally, number 1 takes us to a devastating murder. Enjoy your new life without us. He's dead, and soon I will be too. This chilling last message was sent from Tony Morano, who attempted to commit suicide while also throwing his 7-month-old baby over a bridge. Tony survived this 90-foot plunge into the Connecticut River, but the body of of his baby was found a mile downstream 2 days later. Tony was having a bitter custody battle with his ex-girlfriend, and he even had a restraining order against her. Sadly, this innocent little boy lost his life, and now Tony will spend the rest of his life behind bars for this murder.